They say the past never stays buried. But what happens when a city forgets its dead, covering their resting place with playgrounds and picnic benches? What happens when bones lie restless beneath the laughter of the living? Blackwood Park was meant to be a symbol of renewal. Fresh grass, towering oak trees, and winding trails where families could roam without a care. But beneath the roots and soil, the land kept a secret, one that should have never been disturbed. Strange things began happening the moment construction started. Workers vanishing, tools rusting overnight, and whispers creeping through the wind like the voices of those long forgotten. No one listened. No one cared. Until it was too late. Now those who enter the park at dusk speak of shadows that don't belong, of laughter that doesn't sound quite human. A woman jogging alone hears footsteps behind her, but when she turns, nothing. A child vanishes near the old fountain, only to be found hours later, staring blankly, whispering names no one recognizes. Was it just paranoia, or was something far worse lurking beneath? What do you think? Should we ever build over the dead? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're ready to dive into the chilling mystery of the graveyard beneath the park, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who loves a good horror story. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The first time they broke ground at Blackwood Park, the machine stopped working. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was every single one. Bulldozers sputtered to silence, excavators refused to dig, and even the simple hand tools turned brittle in workers' hands. The foreman, Daniel Greaves, dismissed it as bad luck. "Machines fail," he said with a shrug. "Keep working." But the workers weren't so sure. "I swear I heard something," one of them muttered, staring at the half-dug hole where the old soil had been ripped open. "Like a voice, calling my name." "Shut up, man," his coworker whispered. "You're just creeped out because of the stories." The stories, the ones the old folks in town still whispered about. Long before the city bought the land for the park, Blackwood had been a burial ground, an unmarked graveyard used centuries ago for those who were never claimed, those no one mourned. Over time, people forgot, but the dead never did. That first day, nothing more happened beyond the strange silence of the machines. But by the second day, men started quitting. Greaves walked onto the site that morning and found two workers standing outside the fence, their faces pale, hands trembling. "We're done," one of them said. "What the hell do you mean you're done? We just started." The man shook his head. "You don't get it, boss. Something's wrong here. I saw something last night." Greaves folded his arms. "What? A ghost?" He scoffed. "This is a construction site, not a haunted house." But the worker didn't laugh. Number. "It was worse than that." He swallowed hard, glancing at his partner before continuing. "I came back late to grab my jacket. Thought I saw someone standing in the middle of the dirt lot. A woman, pale, long hair. But her eyes, God, her eyes weren't right." Greaves frowned. "What do you mean?" "They were hollow, black, and she was whispering something, but I couldn't understand. The second I stepped closer, she vanished." Greaves groaned. Probably just some kid messing around. But the worker grabbed his arm. Number, it wasn't a kid, and it wasn't messing around. His grip tightened. "Something's here, and it doesn't want us digging." Greaves pulled away and waved him off. "Fine. Quit if you want. More money for the rest of us." The men left, and the work continued. But they should have listened. The unearthed bones. By the third day, the real nightmare began. A backhoe hit something solid beneath the dirt. The operator, curious, climbed out and started digging by hand. The more he uncovered, the more he realized this wasn't just a chunk of stone. It was a skeleton. At first, Greaves thought it was just one. But then another appeared, and another, and another. "We need to stop," one of the remaining workers said. "Call someone. This is a burial site." Greaves hesitated. Legally, they should have reported it. But that meant stopping the project for months, maybe years. Money was at stake. "Bag it up," he finally said. "Keep working." That was his first mistake. That night, the screaming started. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even fully human. It was a whispering shriek that curled through the air like a distant wind. The workers who stayed in the temporary trailers swore they heard it. Some of them packed up their things and left in the middle of the night, refusing to say a word. By morning, Greaves arrived to find his crew down to half its size. He was furious, until he noticed the tracks in the dirt. Footsteps, dozens of them, leading from the burial pit to the trailers. And worse, the bones they had unearthed the day before, gone. Shadows in the fog. The park was nearly finished within the next month, despite the dwindling workforce and the constant air of unease. But as soon as the grand opening approached, strange sightings became frequent. The first report came from a woman walking her dog near the playground. She claimed she saw a man standing beneath the trees, motionless, staring at her. When she blinked, he was gone. Another family reported their daughter talking to a nice lady near the old stone fountain. When they turned to look, no one was there. And then there was the fog. It rolled in thick at night, swallowing the park in a heavy mist that muffled sound. But within the fog, people swore they could hear something. Faint voices whispering, footsteps crunching, and, if you listen closely enough, laughter, not the joyful kind, the kind that sent shivers down your spine. The first disappearance. It wasn't until the first disappearance that people truly started to panic. A teenager named Jason Ward had been hanging out with friends near the old memorial plaque, daring each other to stay past midnight. He had laughed, taken a step forward, then stopped. His friends watched as his expression twisted into something between fear and confusion. "What's wrong?" one of them asked. Jason didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he started walking. "Jason, where are you going?" No response. He moved toward the trees, slow, deliberate. His friends ran after him, but the moment they reached the edge of the woods, he was gone, vanished. They searched for hours, called his name, but there was nothing, not a single sign of him. By the time the police arrived, the only thing they found was Jason's phone, lying in the dirt. The screen was still on, a recording app running. The last thing he had captured was his own voice. "What? Who are you?" A pause, then a sharp intake of breath, and then nothing but static. Jason was never found, but he wouldn't be the last. Do you think Jason's disappearance was an accident, or is there something lurking beneath Blackwood Park? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next chilling installment of The Graveyard Beneath the Park. The town tried to move on from Jason Ward's disappearance, but the whispers never stopped. Some said he ran away. Others, mostly the older residents who remembered the stories, knew better. And then a second person vanished. Her name was Claire Hollis, a school teacher who took her morning jog through Blackwood Park every Saturday. She was well-liked, dependable, and the last person anyone expected to disappear without a trace. Her husband reported her missing when she never came home. The police searched every inch of the park, but all they found was her fitness tracker, still strapped to her wrist. The band had been torn apart, as if something had ripped it off. The town grew uneasy. 2 disappearances in less than a month? It couldn't be a coincidence. But it wasn't until the 3rd disappearance that the town realized this wasn't just bad luck. This was a warning. The night the statues moved. A week after Claire went missing, something strange happened at the park. A couple, Nathan and Olivia Carter, were walking their dog near the old memorial fountain when Olivia suddenly stopped. "Nathan, did that statue just move?" Nathan frowned. The fountain, an old relic from the 1800s, had a series of stone figures around its edge. Children carved in eerie, lifelike detail. But they had been there for years, unmoving, silent. "You're imagining things," he said. But Olivia wasn't so sure. The statue she was pointing at, a little girl with her hands cupped as if holding water, looked different. Her head was tilted in a way Olivia swore it hadn't been before. She shivered but brushed it off. Maybe she was tired. Maybe the fog rolling in made things look distorted. They kept walking, but halfway across the park their dog started growling. Then a sound. Not the wind, not rustling leaves. A soft scraping noise. Stone against stone. Olivia spun around. Her breath caught in her throat. The statue had moved. Not just its head, The little girl's arms were now stretched outward, her fingers curled as if reaching for something. Or someone. "We need to leave," Olivia whispered, pulling Nathan's arm. They turned, and the fog swallowed them whole. Nathan shouted. Olivia clutched his sleeve. The dog barked wildly, its eyes wide with terror. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the fog lifted. Everything looked normal again. The statues stood motionless, just as they always had. But there was something different. The little girl statue was smiling now. The return of the bones. The next morning, park maintenance arrived for their daily routine. But when they reached the old fountain, they found something that stopped them cold. Bones, scattered around the base of the fountain. Not animal bones, human, and not old either. Fresh enough that the police were called immediately. Detective Eric Lawson, a veteran officer who had been investigating the disappearances, knelt beside the remains, his face grim. "The graveyard," he muttered under his breath. "What?" one of the officers asked. Lawson stood, rubbing a hand over his jaw. This park was built over a burial site. Some graves were exhumed, but a lot of them, they were left behind. He turned to the other officers. "Get forensic analysis started immediately." The results came back fast. The bones belonged to Jason Ward. The town went silent. Jason had vanished a month ago. No sign of struggle, no explanation. And now his remains had resurfaced in the middle of the park. But that wasn't the worst part. The medical examiner confirmed something chilling. Jason's bones had bite marks, human teeth. Something in the dark fear gripped the town. People stopped going to the park. Parents warned their children to stay away. But despite the warnings, there were always those who didn't listen. One night, 3 teenagers dared each other to sneak into the park. Lena, Marcus, and Troy climbed the rusted fence just after midnight, laughing off their nerves. They had heard the stories, but they didn't believe them. Not yet. The air inside the park was colder than it should have been. The trees loomed taller. The statues near the fountain seemed wrong. "Let's go to the burial site," Marcus suggested, smirking. Troy rolled his eyes. "Come on, dude, that's just a rumor. There's no—" Snap. A branch broke behind them. They froze. Wind? An animal? Then the whisper came. "You shouldn't be here." Lena turned in horror. A figure stood beneath the trees. Not quite a man, not quite a shadow. It watched them. The moment they saw it, the thing moved. Not running, gliding, sliding through the air as if its feet never touched the ground. The teenagers screamed. They turned and ran, tearing through the fog as fast as they could. When they reached the fence, Lena scrambled over first, followed by Troy. But Marcus wasn't with them. They turned back, breathless, hearts pounding. The park was silent, empty. Marcus was gone. Only his shoes remained, lying in the dirt. And on the fence, right where he had been climbing, was a bloody handprint. The town is terrified. People are disappearing. The dead are returning. And something inside Blackwood Park is watching. What do you think is happening? Is the graveyard reclaiming what was stolen? Or is something even worse waiting beneath the park? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next terrifying chapter of the graveyard beneath the park. Blackwood Park was no longer a place for laughter. Parents no longer brought their children. Joggers avoided it. Even the town's stray animals seemed to sense something was wrong, disappearing into the woods and never returning. But the police couldn't close the park, not without proof. And proof was exactly what Detective Eric Lawson was determined to find. That's why he was here, standing at the edge of the playground just after sunset, his breath misting in the cold air. He had reviewed every case: Jason Ward, Claire Hollis, Marcus Reynolds. 3 disappearances, 1 confirmed dead, and the other 2 still missing. The bodies had to be somewhere, and he was going to find them. He adjusted his flashlight and stepped forward. The moment his foot crossed the threshold of the park, the wind died. The air was heavy, still, like the world itself was holding its breath. Lawson exhaled and pressed on. The swings that moved on their own. The playground was empty, except for the swings. One of them swayed lightly, as if someone had just been sitting there. Lawson approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He shined his flashlight over the seat. Dust, cobwebs, undisturbed. But then, creak! The swing moved again, slow, deliberate. Lawson turned, scanning the area. Nothing. No wind, no movement. Then a voice. "Help me!" Lawson spun around, heart hammering. The voice had been soft, barely a whisper. But he heard it, his fingers curled around the grip of his gun. "Who's there?" he called. Silence. Then behind him, the swing stopped moving. Lawson's grip tightened. He wasn't a superstitious man, but something about this place made his skin crawl. He was about to leave when he noticed something in the dirt. Footprints, small ones, leading away from the swing set. And they weren't fading, they were fresh. The child in the fog. Lawson followed the footprints cautiously, leading him toward the old fountain. The same fountain where Jason Ward's remains had been found. The fog had begun to roll in now, thick and suffocating. Then just beyond the mist, a figure, small, still, a child. She stood near the base of the fountain, wearing a tattered dress, her long dark hair tangled. "Hey," Lawson called out, stepping forward. "Are you okay?" The girl lifted her head, her eyes black as night. Lawson stopped cold. Something was wrong. Her mouth moved, but the words she whispered weren't in English. They weren't even human. The air around her twisted, warped, and then she took a step forward. Lawson stepped back, his instincts screaming. But then she spoke again. This time he understood. "He's coming." A gust of wind slammed into him, sending his flashlight clattering to the ground. The fog swirled violently, and for a split second, he saw them. Faces, dozens of them. Watching, reaching, and then the girl was gone. The fog lifted. Lawson stood alone. His hands were shaking, and carved into the stone of the fountain, as if by invisible hands, were three words: leave or suffer. A mother's desperate plea. The next morning, a woman arrived at the police station. Eleanor Reynolds, Marcus's mother. She looked exhausted, her face pale, eyes swollen from crying. "I need to speak with someone," she whispered. "Please, it's about my son." Lawson took her into his office, offering her a seat. Eleanor gripped the edges of her coat. "I saw him last night," she said. Lawson stiffened. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard. "I woke up around 3 a.m. I heard something outside my window." Her fingers dug into the fabric of her coat. "I looked outside, and he was standing in the yard." Lawson's breath caught. Marcus had been missing for over a week. Eleanor's voice trembled. "He looked wrong. His face was pale. His clothes were covered in dirt." She squeezed her eyes shut. "But it was his eyes." Lawson leaned in. "What about them?" Eleanor's lips quivered. They weren't his anymore. The nightmare in the yard. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "I ran outside, called his name." She stared at Lawson, her hands shaking. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me. Tears welled in her eyes. I took a step forward, and then, she swallowed. He smiled. A shudder ran through her body. Not my son's smile, something else's. She inhaled sharply. Then he whispered something. Lawson braced himself. Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "It's not me, Mom. It's wearing me." Lawson's blood ran cold. The darkness beneath the town was unraveling. Whispers of ghosts, moving statues. A missing boy who had returned, but not as himself. Something had been disturbed beneath Blackwood Park. Something that should have stayed buried. And the worst part? It was only just beginning. The warnings are clear. The missing are returning, but they are not the same. And something is waiting beneath Blackwood Park, watching, growing stronger. Do you think Marcus is still in there somewhere? Or has something else taken his place? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe for the next chilling installment of The Graveyard Beneath the Park. The town of Blackwood was unraveling. People were locking their doors earlier, whispering of shadows that didn't belong, of figures standing at street corners, watching. And worse, More of the missing were coming back, but none of them were themselves. The return of Claire Hollis. 2 weeks after Marcus's mother saw her son in the yard, another figure returned. Claire Hollis, the school teacher. She had been missing for nearly a month, presumed dead, but on a cold, misty morning, she walked into town barefoot, wearing the same jogging outfit she had vanished in. Her skin was pale, almost gray. Her lips were cracked, and her eyes were wrong. People gasped as she stumbled through the town square, whispering in hushed terror. Sheriff Tom Avery approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. "Claire," he called. She stopped, slowly turned, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her mouth twitching into something that was supposed to be a smile. "Where have you been?" the sheriff asked carefully. Claire's body trembled, as if something inside of her was fighting to speak. Finally, she rasped, "Underneath!" A shudder ran through the crowd. Sheriff Avery stepped closer. "Claire, what do you mean? Who took you?" Her lips parted, her eyes lifeless and empty, flicked toward the direction of Blackwood Park. Then she whispered, "They did." And before anyone could react, she collapsed. The tape recording. Claire Hollis was rushed to the hospital. She was alive, but barely. Doctors were baffled. There were no signs of injury, no dehydration, no malnourishment. She should have been in worse condition after being gone for weeks, but she was perfectly preserved, as if something had been keeping her that way. That night, Detective Lawson sat by her hospital bed, watching her breathe. Then his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It contained a single attachment, a recording. Lawson hesitated, then hit play. Static. Then, breathing, ragged, shaky. A woman's voice. "Claire." And then she spoke. Lawson's blood turned to ice. "It's not dead. It was never dead. It's just waiting." The recording cut off, and across the hospital room, Claire's body began to twitch. The man at the window. That same night, Eleanor Reynolds, Marcus's mother, sat in her living room, gripping a mug of cold tea. She hadn't slept in days. She couldn't. Not after seeing Marcus outside her window. Not after hearing what it had whispered. And then, a soft tap. Her breath caught. Slowly, she turned toward the window. The curtains billowed slightly as if something had just moved past them. Her heart pounded. Was it Marcus? Was it something else? Another tap, this time closer. Eleanor forced herself to stand. She reached for the curtain, gripping the fabric with trembling fingers, and yanked it open. Nothing. Just the quiet street, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. She exhaled shakily. Maybe she was imagining things. Then, a reflection in the glass, behind her, a tall, gaunt figure. Too thin, too wrong, its head tilted. And then, in a voice that wasn't human, it laughed. Eleanor screamed. Buried secrets. Lawson and Sheriff Avery met the next morning. Things were escalating too fast. They had to do something. "Enough of this waiting," Avery muttered. "We need to dig." Lawson frowned. "Dig where?" The sheriff exhaled. "Under the park." That afternoon, a crew was sent to the exact spot where Claire Hollis had whispered about, the old graveyard. The digging began at sunset. Shovels hit dirt. Machines hummed. And then, one of the workers screamed. Lawson rushed forward, flashlight in hand. "What is it?" The man pointed a shaking hand at the pit. Lawson's stomach dropped. There, in the freshly dug earth, was a coffin, an old one. Rotten wood, rusted nails. Avery's throat tightened. Whose grave was this? The workers hesitated. Then one of them whispered, "It doesn't match any of the records." A pause. Lawson felt something ice cold curl around his spine. If this grave wasn't supposed to be here, then whose was it? He stepped forward, kneeling beside the coffin. Carefully, he reached out and brushed away the dirt. Something was carved into the wood. Letters. A name. Lawson's breath hitched. Jason Ward. The first man who went missing. But Jason's bones had already been found at the fountain, which meant Something else was inside. Lawson met Avery's gaze. No words were spoken, only the silent agreement that this coffin had to be opened. Slowly, cautiously, they pried the lid open. The wood groaned. The nails screeched against the rotting frame. And then, the lid snapped open. Lawson's breath caught in his throat, because inside the coffin, staring straight up at him, was Jason Ward. Not bones, not decayed, but Jason, perfectly preserved, his skin pale, his lips blue, and his eyes wide open. Lawson stumbled back, heart racing. Avery swallowed hard. Is he? Then, Jason's mouth moved. His lips cracked open. His voice was weak, dry, but his words were clear. You shouldn't have done that. And then, his body sat up. Jason Ward should not have been sitting up. His body had been declared dead months ago. His remains had been found. And yet, here he was, perfectly intact, eyes staring blankly ahead, lips trembling as if struggling to form words. Detective Lawson and Sheriff Avery stood frozen at the edge of the pit, their breaths caught in their throats. Jason's fingers twitched. Then, his head snapped toward them, and he smiled. Not the warm, human smile of a man happy to be found, but a grotesque, stretched mockery of a grin. You let it out, he whispered. The air around them dropped in temperature, and then Jason moved, the thing that wore Jason's skin. Before either man could react, Jason lunged. His body moved in a jerking, unnatural way, like a marionette whose strings had been violently yanked. Lawson barely had time to step back as Jason grabbed his wrist. Cold. So cold. Jason's fingers dug into his skin with inhuman strength, nails cutting deep. Lawson gasped, trying to pry himself free, but Jason's dead grip was relentless. His eyes, completely black now, stared into Lawson's, unblinking. And then Jason spoke, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was deep, hollow, wrong. It was never meant to be disturbed. Lawson's vision blurred. The world around him shifted. He saw the ground splitting open, a pit of endless darkness, something massive, writhing, waiting, hungry, and then a scream. Sheriff Avery. He had tackled Jason, ripping him away from Lawson, sending them, both crashing into the dirt. Jason twisted unnaturally, his body contorting in ways a human body shouldn't. Then he scuttled backward into the coffin, like an animal retreating to its burrow. And without warning, the coffin lid slammed shut. The wind roared. The hole where the coffin had been collapsed inward. And Jason Ward was gone. The hospital wake-up. Lawson woke up in a hospital bed. His skin was freezing, his pulse weak. The nurses said he had been unconscious for over 10 hours. Avery sat by his bedside, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. You were out cold, he muttered. They found you collapsed next to that damn pit. Lawson's voice was hoarse. Jason? Avery hesitated, then shook his head. Gone, he said, like he was never there. Lawson swallowed hard, because he knew what he saw. And worse, he knew Jason would be back. Eleanor's second visitor. That night, Eleanor Reynolds sat in the darkness of her living room, clutching the rosary her mother had given her. She hadn't told anyone about the man in the window. Not that it mattered, because he was back. She could feel him. The air was thick, heavy. Then, the floor creaked behind her. Eleanor froze. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head. A shadow stood in the doorway. Tall, too tall, and in its hand, something dangled. Eleanor's breath hitched. It was a necklace. Marcus's necklace. The same one she had given him for his 12th birthday. The shadow took a slow step forward. Mom. The voice was Marcus's, but the thing wearing his skin was not her son. The whispering playground. By now, Blackwood Park had become a ghost town. No children played on the swings. No joggers ran the trails. But at night, people swore they could hear things. Soft laughter, the whisper of little feet running through the grass, and worse, the merry-go-round spun by itself. Sheriff Avery ordered the park to be closed indefinitely, but closing the gates wouldn't change anything, because whatever was beneath the park was waking up. The man who dug too deep. 2 days later, a local groundskeeper named Henry Briggs made a terrible mistake. Ignoring the warnings, he returned to the park with a shovel. "I just wanted to see," he told his wife before leaving. Henry never came back. Instead, his wife woke up that night to the sound of digging. She found Henry in the backyard, barefoot, shoveling furiously at the earth. His hands were bloody, his nails cracked and broken, and his mouth. He was whispering something, over and over again. She stepped closer, trembling. Henry, he didn't stop, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge her, just kept digging and whispering, "It's under us. It's always been under us." The unmarked graves, Lawson and Avery, made one final attempt to get answers. They returned to the town's archives, searching for any mention of the graveyard beneath the park. And they found it. A single entry, 1896. The old cemetery was never supposed to be built over, but the town's founders, ignoring all warnings, had done it anyway. And in doing so, they had buried something far older, something that had been waiting. Lawson ran a shaking hand over his face. They had disturbed more than just the dead. And now, whatever was beneath them was awake. The final omen. That night, Blackwood Park stood silent. The swings were still, the slides empty. But at exactly 3:33 a.m., every single street lamp in town flickered. And in the heart of the playground, carved into the bark of the old oak tree, a new message had appeared. 4 words, 4 warnings. You opened the door. The town of Blackwood was breaking apart. No one could deny it now. People whispered of footsteps in empty hallways, of voices calling their names in the dead of night, of their dead loved ones standing in their doorways. But worse, those who looked too long at the figures didn't come back. The hollow ones. Eleanor Reynolds had not spoken a word since the night she saw Marcus in her doorway. She sat in her home staring blankly ahead, eyes hollow. The only sound that ever came from her lips was a whisper, over and over again. "He's not my son. He's not my son. He's not my son." Her sister tried to snap her out of it, tried to shake her, scream at her, beg her to leave town. But Eleanor would only smile, a strange, stretched, too wide smile, and say, "He's in the walls now." The morgue incident, Sheriff Avery barely slept anymore. How could he, with bodies disappearing from the morgue? First it was Claire Hollis, then Henry Briggs, then all of them. By sunrise, the slabs where the dead should have been were empty. No broken locks, no signs of forced entry. The corpses had simply walked away. The girl who spoke to Shadow's one person claimed to know what was happening, a 7-year-old girl named Lily Keene. She was found sitting in the middle of the abandoned Blackwood Park, talking to something that wasn't there. When questioned, she told her parents, "They're mad. They don't like being forgotten. They don't like being under us." When they asked who they were, Lily only laughed and pointed at the empty swing beside her. "They're sitting right here." The sound beneath the fountain. Lawson knew they were running out of time. Whatever was happening wasn't just hauntings. Something else was coming, and it was coming from the ground. He returned to the center of the park, to the old stone fountain where Jason Ward's bones had first been found. This time, he came alone. The night air was thick, heavy. The wind whispered through the trees. Lawson's hands trembled as he set down his recorder. Then he bent down and pressed his ear to the ground. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, scratching. Lawson's breath caught. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear. But it was there, the unmistakable sound of something clawing at the earth. Then another sound joined it, fainter. A voice. Lawson's stomach turned as he realized it was screaming. The disappearance of Sheriff Avery. The next morning, Lawson tried calling Avery. No answer. By noon, Avery's deputy found his patrol car abandoned on the edge of Blackwood Park. The driver's side door was open. The radio was still playing static, and the last message logged into the system was a single, broken transmission. Avery's own voice, shaky, barely a whisper. "It's awake." Then the sound of dragging, and then silence. Avery was never seen again. The Hollow Man walks by sundown. The town was a ghost of itself. Shops were closed. Windows were boarded. Families fled in the night. But for those who stayed, something new arrived, something worse. It started with the children. A little boy named Jacob Foster was the first to see him. He woke in the middle of the night, his throat dry, reaching for a sip of water, when he saw the figure in the doorway. Tall, thin, draped in black, and where a face should have been, only emptiness. It stood there, watching. Then it moved. Jacob screamed. His parents rushed in, flipping on the light. But the figure was gone. Only a faint, lingering whisper remained in the room. A voice that wasn't theirs. A voice that came from the walls. And it said, "Let us in." The marking. By morning, Lawson knew there was no more denying it. This wasn't just ghosts. It wasn't just the dead coming back. Something else had been released, and now it was spreading. Then, the phone rang. It was from Eleanor Reynolds' sister. Her voice was frantic, terrified. "Eleanor's gone," she gasped. She just left in the middle of the night." Lawson tensed. "Did she say anything?" A shaky breath. Then, "She kept writing something, over and over again." Lawson swallowed. "What did she write?" Silence. Then the woman whispered, "The mark is made." Lawson's heart dropped, because even before she said it, he already knew where Eleanor had gone. The final walk. Blackwood Park was waiting. The wind was still, the sky too dark, even for nightfall. Lawson stepped forward. The trees whispered. The air hummed. And there, standing in the exact center of the park, was Eleanor Reynolds. She faced the fountain, her back to him, her head tilted slightly like she was listening. Lawson's breath came slow, careful. "Eleanor?" he called softly. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Then her fingers twitched, and slowly, she turned. Lawson's stomach clenched. Her eyes, they weren't Eleanor's anymore. They were empty. And on her forehead, a symbol had been carved into her skin, a mark. Lawson didn't know what it meant, didn't know what it was calling, but he knew. This was only the beginning. Blackwood was no longer a town. It was a graveyard. People vanished overnight. The streets lay empty, the air thick with silence. And in the center of it all, Blackwood Park, a place that should never have been built, a place that should never have been disturbed. Now something was waking beneath it, and it was hungry. The missing faces. Lawson stood in front of the station's evidence board, staring at the photographs. Eleanor Reynolds, Sheriff Avery, Jason Ward, Henry Briggs. All of them, gone. No bodies, no blood, just missing. And they weren't the only ones. Lawson's radio crackled. A deputy's frantic voice cut through. "Detective, people are disappearing from their homes." Lawson's hands clenched into fists. It was spreading, and they were running out of time. The woman in the mist. That night, a lone fog rolled through town. Thick, unnatural, and in its depths, a figure walked, a woman in white. Some claimed it was Eleanor Reynolds. Others swore it was someone older, something that had been waiting beneath the ground long before Blackwood was ever built. By dawn, 4 more people were missing, their doors left wide open, the scent of damp earth in their rooms, and scrawled onto their walls, written in muddy fingerprints, "The Hollow Man is coming." The return of the dead. The first body appeared on the outskirts of town, then another, except they weren't bodies, not really, because they were still moving. Lawson was the first to see them, the missing people of Blackwood, Jason Ward, Sheriff Avery, Eleanor Reynolds. They stood in the fields staring toward the park, motionless, silent, their eyes hollow, their mouths stitched shut. And as the sun set behind them, they all turned and started walking back into town. The children hear it first. The first to hear the whispers were the children, soft, rhythmic, a chanting beneath the floors. Some of them, too young to understand fear, began to hum along. And that's when the scratching started, fingernails dragging across wood. Lawson questioned one of the kids, a little girl named Sophie. She clutched her teddy bear tightly, rocking back and forth. "They're digging," she whispered. Lawson swallowed hard. "Who's digging?" She shook her head. "The ones who were buried wrong. The graves that never held the dead." The town's records told an ugly truth. Blackwood's first settlers had built over something else, something they had no right to claim, and those buried beneath the park were never supposed to rest because they were never human to begin with. The church bells ring at midnight. The town's church bells had not rung in years, and yet, at exactly midnight, they tolled, slow, hollow, each chime shaking the ground, and with each ring, more of the dead returned. They came in droves, silent, watching, waiting, until a figure stepped out from their midst, taller than the rest, draped in black and faceless. The hollow man had arrived. The final warning. Lawson ran to the station, breath ragged. He grabbed the radio, voice shaking. "Anyone still left in town? Get out." Static. Then, a voice, software, mocking. "You can't run," it whispered. Lawson's blood ran cold. The radio clicked off by itself. And outside, the church bells tolled one last time. Blackwood was silent. Not the silence of peace, not the quiet of sleep. This was something worse, something that pulsed beneath the earth, that slithered through the cracks of reality, that watched from the empty streets. Something that had been waiting. Now the hollow man had returned, and no one was safe. The final survivors. Lawson stood at the edge of town, gripping the shotgun he knew was useless. Beside him, only 3 others remained. Sarah Keene, the mother of the little girl who spoke to shadows. Deputy Harlow, the last remaining officer. Father Gabriel, the town's priest. They had no plan, no chance of survival, and yet they had nowhere left to run. The black fog, it rolled in like a tide. Thick, choking, screaming, a windless force, swallowing streets, homes, everything in its path. And in the center of it, the hollow man. His form was shifting, stretching, becoming something larger. Something that had once been worshipped. The forgotten ritual. Sarah gasped. "Lily's drawings!" Lawson turned to her desperate. "What?" She clutched her daughter's notebook, flipping through the pages. She kept drawing this circle, a symbol older than the town itself, a sigil meant to bind something, meant to lock it beneath the earth. But it had been broken. And now, the hollow man was free. The unfinished yearbook. In the library's archives, Lawson found the missing records. Blackwood's founders had lied. The land had not been empty when they arrived. It had been a place of sacrifice, a place where something ancient was worshipped, something that required a price. And when the town's founders refused to pay, they buried it alive. Now it had risen, and it remembered. The hollow man speaks. For the first time, the thing in the fog spoke. Its voice was a chorus, 1,000 screams layered over one another. It did not threaten, did not rage. It simply laughed. "You built your homes on my grave," it whispered. "You paved roads over my mouth. You walked above me, never knowing you stood on the edge of a nightmare." And then, it reached for them, the last stand. Father Gabriel threw down the holy book. "It won't stop this," he whispered. "We need to finish the binding." Lawson and Sarah moved fast. They drew the sigil in the dirt, hands shaking. The fog thickened, pressing against them. And then, the ground cracked open. Hands, too many hands, clawed their way out. The hollow man roared, and the world collapsed. The end of Blackwood. By dawn, Blackwood was gone. The streets were empty, the houses abandoned. No bodies were ever found. The town simply ceased to exist, all except for one thing, the park. The fountain stood untouched. And if you listen, if you press your ear to the ground, you can still hear it. The sound of something breathing, waiting. Because the hollow man never truly leaves. He only waits for the next town foolish enough to build on his grave. What do you think happened to Blackwood? And do you believe the hollow man will return? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more terrifying stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next nightmare. That concludes The Graveyard Beneath the Park. Let me know if you want any changes or another horror story.